Hello, my dear friends. Nobody is telling you how close it actually is. Not the mainstream conversation that has never found a way to speak honestly about what is moving through this planet's deeper currents of change. Not the institutions that have every reason to maintain the appearance of stability for as long as possible. Not even most of the spiritual community, which has been discussing the 3 days of darkness for years while consistently, perhaps unconsciously, placing its arrival at a comfortable distance. But the Pleiadians are telling you today, and what they want to transmit, directly, without the gradual building toward a central point that most transmissions allow, without the careful hedging that makes difficult information more comfortable to receive, is something that those who are genuinely paying attention to their inner lives have already been sensing without having the framework to fully understand what they were sensing. The 3 days of darkness is closer than anyone is publicly admitting. Not as a prediction with a specific date. The Pleiadians have always been careful about the relationship between genuine cosmic transmission and the human tendency to convert any indication of timing into a fixed calendar event. That is not what this is. This is something different. This is a description of where the process actually is, of the specific markers that indicate proximity, not in the abstract sense that something significant is approaching, but in the immediate sense that the approach has reached a stage that the most sensitive and the most genuinely awake members of the human family can no longer fail to notice. And what the Pleiadians want to speak about today is not simply how close it is. It is what happens first. Because the 3 days of darkness does not begin with the darkness. It begins with something else entirely. Something that is already happening. Something that those who know how to look are already seeing in the specific quality of the current moment. Stay with this all the way to the end. Because what the Pleiadians describe about what happens first will change the way you understand everything that has been happening in your inner life over the past several months. There is something important to establish before the Pleiadians describe what happens first. Something that determines the quality of everything that follows it. The 3 days of darkness, in the Pleiadian understanding, is not a punishment. It is not a cosmic catastrophe that humanity has failed to prevent. It is not a judgment delivered from above upon a civilization that has fallen short of some standard of worthiness. It is a process. A natural, inevitable, intelligently designed process, designed not by any single being or council of beings, but by the organizing intelligence of a cosmos that has been moving toward this moment for a very long time, through which the fundamental frequency conditions of this planet make the transition that they have been building toward for longer than recorded human history. The darkness is not the event. The darkness is the threshold, the moment between what has been and what comes next. The pause in which the old frequency conditions complete their dissolution and the new frequency conditions establish their foundation. And what happens first is what makes that threshold navigable rather than overwhelming. Here is what the Pleiadians say happens first. The first thing that happens before the 3 days of darkness is what they describe as the stilling of the noise. Not the noise of the external world, though that stilling will eventually come as part of the threshold itself, but the noise of the inner world, the constant, relentless, usually below conscious commentary that constitutes the background texture of most people's experience of being alive, the reviewing of the past, the projecting into the future, the endless assessment and comparison and judgment and anticipation that most human minds produce continuously without pause. In the period immediately preceding the 3 days of darkness, many sensitive souls have been noticing something unusual happening to this inner noise. Moments where it stops more completely than ordinary practice produces. Where a quality of genuine silence descends that is different from the silence of meditation or the calm of an especially peaceful moment. A quality of silence that feels imposed rather than cultivated. That arrives without effort and without the usual conditions that produce inner quiet. That carries in its very completeness a quality of significance, of something having cleared the way, of the ordinary noise of ordinary consciousness having been temporarily, but genuinely suspended by something operating at a level below ordinary consciousness. This is the first thing that happens. The inner environment begins to prepare itself, not through conscious decision or deliberate practice, but through the natural response of a consciousness that is, at its deeper levels, already aware of what is approaching. Many people who are experiencing this are not recognizing it for what it is. They describe it as periods of unusual clarity that appear without obvious cause, as moments where the ordinary anxiety and business of mental life simply stops, briefly and completely, in ways that leave them feeling both unsettled and strangely peaceful, as a quality of inner environment that is somehow different from anything they have experienced before, in ways they cannot quite articulate. This is the inner stilling, and it is the first sign that the 3 days of darkness is doing what it does before it arrives, preparing the consciousness that will move through it. The second thing that happens is what the Pleiadians call the acceleration of completion. Things that have been in the background of awareness for a long time, unresolved matters, unaddressed truths, relationships that carry unspoken realities, aspects of the inner life that have been managed and worked around rather than genuinely addressed. These begin to press forward with unusual urgency, not as crisis, not as breakdown, but as the natural movement of a system that is being, at levels below ordinary awareness, prepared for a threshold that does not allow for the carrying of unfinished business across it. The pressure to complete what is genuinely ready to be completed. The movement toward resolution of what has been genuinely resolvable but has been deferred. Many sensitive souls have been noticing this acceleration in recent months. Old patterns that have been in process for years suddenly completing with a speed that the sustained work of many years had not produced. Old wounds that had been carefully and consistently worked with suddenly finding the depth of healing that all that work had been building toward. Old relationships that had been carrying unresolved tension suddenly finding, with surprising ease, the honest conversation that resolved what had been held for years. This is not coincidence. It is preparation. The field is clearing. The consciousness is completing what needs to be completed before the threshold arrives, at levels of awareness that operate below ordinary conscious decision-making, but that are, in the Pleiadian understanding, far more intelligent and far more purposefully organized than ordinary consciousness tends to recognize. The third thing that happens is what the Pleiadians describe as the emergence of unusual perception. In the period before the 3 days of darkness, many genuinely sensitive souls begin to notice changes in how they perceive. Not dramatic or frightening changes, subtle ones. The sense that ordinary spaces are carrying unusual qualities of presence. That ordinary encounters with other people are revealing dimensions that were not previously accessible. That the boundary between what is ordinarily perceivable and what is not is becoming, in certain moments, unexpectedly thin. Dreams become more vivid, not merely more memorable, but qualitatively different, carrying a density of experience and a quality of significance that ordinary dreams do not typically carry. Sometimes containing imagery or encounters that carry a quality of genuine meaning rather than the ordinary processing of daily experience. The early morning hours, particularly between 2 and 4, carry a quality of unusual clarity, a wakefulness that arrives not from insomnia or anxiety, but from something that feels more like being called to a quality of awareness that the ordinary sleeping consciousness cannot quite accommodate. These perceptual changes are not signs of something going wrong. The Pleiadians are very clear about this. If you are experiencing unusual perceptual clarity, unusual dream intensity, unusual quality of encounter with other souls, these are not symptoms of psychological instability or spiritual crisis. They are the perceptual system beginning to expand into the range that the 3 days of darkness will require. The consciousness developing, before the threshold arrives, some degree of familiarity with the dimensions of perception that the threshold will make suddenly and fully available, so that when the expansion comes, it does not arrive in a consciousness that has no previous experience of the territory. The fourth thing, and the one the Pleiadians say is the most significant of all the things that happen first, is what they describe as the activation of genuine knowing, not knowledge. Not information accumulated through study or teaching or the following of spiritual traditions, but knowing. The direct, immediate, preconceptual awareness of something being true that arrives before any reasoning process has assembled the case for it. Many souls who are genuinely awake have always had some access to this kind of knowing. But in the period immediately preceding the 3 days of darkness, the quality of this access changes. It becomes more consistent, more reliable, more immediately recognizable as genuine knowing rather than as the wishful thinking or anxiety projection that the ordinary mind can sometimes mistake for genuine perception. The knowing of what is real in a relationship, the knowing of what is actually happening beneath the surface of a situation, the knowing of what choice is genuinely called for in a given moment, before the rational mind has had time to assemble its deliberations. The knowing, quiet and certain and no longer easily overridden, of what one is here for and what the specific next step of genuine service actually is. This activation of genuine knowing is the inner preparation for what the 3 days of darkness makes fully available. Because the threshold event itself is, in the Pleiadian understanding, a transmission of extraordinary frequency that carries genuine knowing at levels of completeness and clarity that ordinary consciousness cannot access. And the consciousness that has been developing genuine knowing in the period preceding the threshold will be far better equipped to receive and integrate what the transmission carries than a consciousness that has had no previous experience of knowing in this mode. The fifth thing that happens before the 3 days of darkness is the arrival of what the Pleiadians call the peace that precedes the threshold. Not the peace of things being resolved or circumstances being favorable or the future being clear and secure, but a different quality of peace entirely. A peace that arises not from any condition of the outer life, but from something at a much deeper level of the inner life. Many sensitive souls have been encountering brief, but unmistakable moments of this quality in recent months. Moments where the ordinary sense of urgency and incompleteness and the persistent low-level anxiety of a consciousness that is always oriented toward an unresolved future simply stops. Where what remains, in the absence of that orientation, is a quality of genuine okayness that does not depend on anything being different. These moments are not permanent. They come and go. They are not yet the sustained baseline of inner experience, but they are becoming more frequent, more reliably accessible, more recognizable as something real rather than something produced by temporary fortunate circumstances. The Pleiadians say this peace is the inner life beginning to register what it cannot yet fully consciously know. That the thing it has been oriented toward for so long, the resolution, the completion, the arrival of what the long journey has been building toward, is genuinely close. That the orientation toward a future in which everything will finally make sense can begin to relax, because the future it has been reaching toward is no longer distant. This is the peace that precedes the threshold, and its increasing presence in the inner lives of those who are genuinely paying attention is one of the clearest indicators the Pleiadians point to when they say the 3 days of darkness is closer than anyone is publicly admitting. The Pleiadians close this transmission with something direct. Everything that has been described today is already happening, not as abstract possibility or future projection, but as current reality in the inner lives of those who are sensitive enough to notice what is actually occurring and honest enough to take seriously what they notice. the inner stilling, the acceleration of completion, the emergence of unusual perception, the activation of genuine knowing, the peace that precedes the threshold. If you have been experiencing any of these things, and if several of them feel like accurate descriptions of what has actually been happening in your inner life in recent months, you are not imagining things. You are not projecting spiritual expectation onto ordinary experience. You are experiencing what happens first. And what happens first is already happening. There is one final dimension the Pleiadians want to add. Something that addresses not the signs of proximity, but the quality of response that genuine proximity calls for. The awareness that the 3 days of darkness is genuinely close, not someday, not eventually, but now, in this period, in the specific circumstances of the lives being lived right now, calls for something that most people find genuinely difficult. It calls for presence, not the performance of preparation, not the dramatic reorganization of an entire life in response to the awareness of approaching threshold, not the anxious accumulation of external readiness that ultimately addresses everything except the one thing that actually matters. Presence. Genuine, unhurried, fully inhabited presence with the life that is actually being lived right now, with the relationships that are actually present, with the inner life that is actually happening, with the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable texture of the days that constitute the period between now and the threshold. Because the threshold will find what is actually there, not the ideal version of a life that has been organized in anticipation of it, not the spiritual presentation that has been carefully assembled for the occasion, but the actual quality of consciousness that has been genuinely inhabited day by day, in the specific ordinary moments of the specific ordinary life. The 3 days of darkness is closer than anyone admits. And the most important response to that proximity is to be more genuinely present, more honest, more genuinely caring, more fully inhabited, in every ordinary moment between now and its arrival. That is all, and it is everything. Take what resonates. Leave what does not, and trust yourself completely to know the difference. This content is offered for spiritual reflection, symbolic interpretation, and personal insight only. It is not presented as scientific fact, medical advice, or a prediction of real-world events. The narration in this video is generated using artificial intelligence voice technology. Please use your own discernment and personal judgment when engaging with this material.